Moving on now to grammatical categories, or parts of speech. So in any language, the parts of speech can differ from other languages, right? We determine which parts of speech a particular language has based on the grammatical patterns in that language. In Algonquian languages, it's traditional to distinguish only four main parts of speech, which are nouns, pronouns, verbs, and particles. Where particles, this is really a cover term for any words that don't inflect. So in general, Algonquian words usually have quite a lot of inflection, but there is a class of words that don't use any inflection, so we call all of these particles. So we'll just tell you a little bit about each of these classes. So the class of nouns is divided into two further syntactic classes. What are called dependent nouns have to be possessed. So these, you might have heard of this in other courses. These are also known as inalienably possessed nouns, nouns that have to have a possessor. And in Algonquian, most of these are either nouns that denote relatives, so kinship terms. So, for example, the noun that means somebody's son, or mother, or cousin, that sort of thing. And also nouns that denote body parts. So the words for heart and head and brain and hand and so on. Both of these have to occur with a possessor. Okay, so these are called dependent nouns. And then there are other nouns that don't have to have a possessor. So nouns like tree or house or shoe, they can be possessed, but they don't have to be. These are called independent nouns. Pronouns, there's not a lot to say about pronouns. They're kind of like pronouns in any language, so there are various types. So we have personal pronouns, which, as I said earlier, are only used for emphasis, right? So pronouns that mean things like I or you, they're only needed because the verb already expresses this. So you only need the pronoun if you want to emphasize it. There's usually a set of demonstratives for things like this and that, indefinite pronouns such as somebody, and interrogative pronouns such as who. One slightly interesting thing about pronouns in Algonquian languages is that most of the languages also have what's called a noun substitute. So in English, if you want to use a noun, but you forget what the exact word is, we often say something like, what's his name, or whatchamacallit, or that one. Right? So Algonquian languages have the same thing, but it's actually a full-fledged pronoun that inflects just like a normal pronoun does. So it inflects for gender, which is animate or inanimate. It inflects for number, singular or plural. It inflects for a category called obviation, which we'll talk about later. So the noun substitute. In English, it's kind of this ad hoc phrase like what's its name or whatchamacallit. But in Algonquian languages, it's really a full-fledged pronoun, part of the pronoun system. Moving on to verbs, which are by far the most complex of the grammatical categories in Algonquian languages. So there are four subclasses of verbs based on their morphology. And this is determined by a suffix that occurs at the end of the verb stem. The suffix is called a final. It's a derivational suffix, and it has two functions. It marks the verb as being either transitive or intransitive. Okay, so every verb, there's a root, which gives you the meaning, and that root comes along with a suffix that either says, I'm a transitive verb, or I'm an intransitive verb. That suffix does one additional thing. It tells us whether or not one of the verb's arguments is animate. Okay, so it doesn't just say, I'm an intransitive verb. It says, I'm an intransitive verb, and my subject is animate, or inanimate. Where animate refers to the idea of animacy, which is the Algonquian equivalent of grammatical gender. So in Indo-European languages, nouns are often divided into masculine or feminine. In Algonquian languages, there's no masculine-feminine distinction, but there is a distinction between animate and inanimate nouns, which roughly corresponds with nouns that denote living beings and nouns that denote non-living things. So if you put together those two functions of finals, we have four different classes of verbs. So there are two classes of intransitive verbs. Animate intransitive verbs have an animate actor or an animate subject, and inanimate intransitive verbs have an inanimate actor or an inanimate subject. If we turn to transitive verbs, again, there's a transitive inanimate and a transitive animate. And in this case, what we care about is the patient, right, or what we think of as the object. So transitive inanimate verbs, these verbs select an inanimate patient, and transitive animate verbs select an animate patient. So you can see the examples here from Proto-Algonquian. We have the same root that forms four different verb stems. So the root is punk, and it means the idea of falling or being fallen. And then depending on what final you add, you get 4 different verb stems. So the first one, punkashin, means to fall when you're talking about something animate. The second one, punkathen, that means to fall when you're talking about something inanimate. And then the 2 transitive ones, punkashim, that means to drop something. So it's the idea of falling, but because it's transitive, you're making something fall, right? So you're dropping something. In this case, the thing that you're dropping is animate. And then punkathet, with an inanimate final, means you're dropping something inanimate. I think I have the TI and TA labels crossed here, so that's just a small error on the slide. Okay, and then finally we come to the class of particles. So particles, as I said before, it's a cover term for anything that doesn't inflect. And this includes, so it doesn't include nouns, verbs, and pronouns, but it does include quantifiers, numerals, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions. So a lot of things that we would think of as function words, but also things like adjectives and adverbs that can have some actual lexical content. So what these all share is that they don't take inflection. Some particles can occur in a special position. They occur immediately before a stem, and they're sort of almost like eclitic in that they're bound to the stem. So 2 Ojibwe examples. The example in A, da animaja, this means he will leave. So the verb form there, maja, means he or she leave. And then we have 2 particles. There's a particle ta, which adds the idea of future, and the particle ene, which adds the idea of away. The example in B is a noun, so waboyan is the blanket, and we've got 2 particles that occur immediately before it, gitche and misko, which mean big and red. So this is big red blanket. When particles are used in this position, very intimately connected to the following stem, they're either known as preverbs when they precede a verb, or prenouns when they precede a noun. So you'll definitely come across the idea of preverbs in particular when we're talking about inflection of verbs in your language. A question you might ask is, so we've talked about a lot of categories, right? Nouns, verbs, pronouns, particles. What about adjectives? We often think of adjectives as a fairly basic part of speech in many languages, but Algonquian languages don't have a distinct grammatical class of adjectives. There are, of course, words that have adjective-like meanings. So the prenouns that we saw in the previous slide, we have a pronoun getche, which means big, and a pronoun misko, which means red. But these are just particles in grammatical terms. They don't behave any differently from any other particles. Okay, so there's no reason to break these off as a special class of adjectives, because grammatical classes are not determined by meaning. Right? Grammatical classes are determined by grammatical properties, and these words don't have any special grammatical properties that would make us put them into a class of their own. There are also adjective-like meanings that are expressed not by particles, but by verbs. So 2 examples from Delaware. There's a verb walasi, which means to be good, and a verb gatobi, which means to be hungry. Okay, so good and hungry in English are adjectives, but in Delaware and in most Algonquian languages, these are verbs. So they inflect the same as verbs, they're used the same as verbs in sentences, they're just grammatically verbs. And so Delaware and Algonquian languages very often use intransitive verbs to express notions that we would think of as being adjectival. But again, there's no justification for calling these words adjectives in Algonquian languages because their grammatical patterns are not different from those of other verbs. So the verb walasi, be good, patterns exactly the same as a verb that would mean, for example, to be asleep, right, or to be sleeping.